Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be with you today. And so I'm going to talk about Symfony 4. And it's not really just about Symfony 4. It's the new way of working with Symfony. So the very first question I want to ask you is, how many of you have already used Symfony, any version? OK. Symfony version 1. I mean, still using Symfony version 1. Version 2, 3, 4 already in production? OK, cool. As you might know, there was a big gap between Symfony 1 and Symfony 2. I would even say that we are talking about two different frameworks. It's not the case anymore. So upgrading from 2 to 3 should be easy enough. 3 to 4 is easier, and I think switching from 4 to 5 is going to be even easier. So what is Symfony 4? The features are almost the same as Symfony 3. We have a few more components, we have a few different things, but more or less this is the same framework. The big difference between Symfony 2, 3, and Symfony 4 is really the developer experience. How you bootstrap a project, how you start a project, and how you can evolve a project over time. And the big difference is also that you can start really small. You can create a very small project with Symfony, like you would have done with Silex, for instance, and you can grow to a big project with many dependencies, many components, and huge dependencies. OK, so let's see how you get started. The very first thing, and that's quite new, instead of using Symfony, the Symfony installer that we had with Symfony 2 and Symfony 3, you can download the Symfony client, the CLI client, which is a Go binary that you can install on your machine. It works for any platforms out there, Linux, macOS, and Windows. And it provides a bunch of things. The first one is an HTTP server, instead of using the PHP built-in server with more features. It can also help you create new projects. And that's how you can get started. So here we are creating a new demo application with the Symfony new command. And if you want to try 5.0, you can use --version equal dev master. I would not recommend you to do that right now, but in a few weeks. OK, so to get started with Symfony 4, you have two ways and two different skeletons. The first one is when you are saying new my project, you are starting a small project with the bare minimum, not that many dependencies. If you want to get started with everything included, including an ORM and all the components coming from Symfony, then you need to use what we call the website skeleton, and you can do that with the -- full option on the command line. That's very important because in Symfony 4, we are not depending on the main Symfony/Symfony repository. We are depending directly on the components, which means that by default, you don't have the form component or the workflow component. And if you need some forms, then you need to be explicit about that, and you need to compose or require your dependencies like form or workflow. And that's a great thing because it means that we can disable everything by default, which means that you have the most performant application by default, and we only enable things when you require them in your project. So if you have the Symfony form dependency in your project, then we are going to enable by default the form component. If it is not there, it is disabled, and you get something that is more performant. OK, so if you have a look at the skeleton, which is the small package, you can see that we don't have that many dependencies. Mainly the basics, so the console, Flex, which is the piece of software managing your project. We are going to talk about that a bit more. YAML for configuration, and framework bundle, which is really the glue between all the components. OK, so if you run that, you will see, so it's going to run Composer, create project behind the scenes, and if you add --debug, you will have the output. And you can see that here we have something that you don't get when you are creating a project without Symfony Flex. And here you can see Symfony operations, recipes. And a recipe is something that is going to configure your project depending on the dependency that you have. So if you have a look at GitHub and the repository for the Symfony skeleton, you will see that there is only one file, the composer.json file, this one, that's all. Everything else is installed and configured depending on your dependencies via recipes. So here you can see that we are going to create some files depending on those 4 dependencies: Flex, Framework Bundle, Console, and Routing. It also executes some scripts like clearing the cache and installing assets. Okay, and at the end you have a small piece of text explaining what to do next, like installing a web server and reading the docs. Now, by default, and that's a big goal of Symfony 4 and the way you are starting to work with Symfony 4, is that Symfony 4 is lightweight in all the sense of the word. So the first thing is we have less files. So if we compare a Symfony 4 application using the Symfony skeleton with a Symfony version 3 using the Symfony Standard Edition, you can see that we have way less files in the vendor directory and globally in your default directory structure. You can also have a look at the directory structure, and you can see that it's a bit different than what you have in Symfony 3. The public directory instead of the web one, we have only one front web controller, which is named index.php. And you can see also that we have less subdirectories. So that's easier to navigate. All the non-PHP files are in their own directory. So we have one directory for templates, one for assets, one for everything really, translations for instance, and everything is decoupled from Symfony, which means that the source directory, this is only about your code, the business logic that you need to write for your application. Everything in the config directory is really about configuration, and we'll see that we have specific files for each dependency that you have in your project. Okay, so as I told you, when you create a new project with Symfony 4, we run recipes, and Flex is running recipes. This is an extract of the recipe for Framework Bundle. And a recipe is really just a bunch of actions that Flex need to run in your local directory. So the first one is bundles. It can register a bundle, so you don't need to register a bundle when you install one. It is done automatically. We can copy files. We can run scripts, which is going to modify your composer.json file. We can register automatically some environment variables, and we can also manage the gitignore file for you. So we are trying to do the most without you doing anything. So that's what is in the manifest.json files, and then everything else is the configuration and the files that we need to copy in your project. So as of today, we have a bunch of recipes, as you can see. We have 2 different repositories for the recipes. The first one is the official one, so the one maintained by the Symfony core team, and it's mainly about the Symfony core components and core bundles. And then we have a contrib one, where we accept any contribution for any open source project and bundle. So you can have a look at those 2 repositories. Okay. So if you're using Symfony skeleton, you also get less dependencies, also because you don't get Symfony, so all the components and all the bundles in there. You only have 25 dependencies. And if you have a closer look, you will see that most of them are not really dependencies. We have a bunch of PSRs, and that's only about interfaces. We have polyfills so that we can use newer features from newer PHP versions, even if you don't upgrade. And then we have a bunch of core dependencies that are useful for any Symfony project. That's what you get when creating a new project with Symfony 2 or Symfony 3 when using the Symfony Standard Edition. And that's what you get with the Symfony 4.1. Way less dependencies, really. Okay. So the next step is trying to have a page in your web browser. So again, we are going to use the Symfony CLI tool. You can use server start -d to go into the background as a daemon, and then you can run server log to get all the logs. And the great thing about server log here is that you get all the logs. from PHP, from your application, from the web server, from everything. So you don't need to have a look at different files and log files. You can have everything here aggregated thanks to this server column log command. That's the default home page, like what we had before. Nothing fancy here. And so by default, you also have the console. Again, we have less commands by default because we have less dependencies. And here, again, you can see, so that's all the files that you have. So if you want to create a new project, you will probably use Git. So you can git init, and you can add all the files, again, because we are configuring the .gitignore file for you. So you don't need to exclude anything. It's done automatically. And as you can see, we have those fancy lines with dash, dash, dash at the beginning and at the end. That's the way we work with Flex and how we can manage your dependencies. So it means that if you remove a dependency, Symfony is going to remove the configuration for that dependency as well. So you can add a new dependency, the configuration is done for you, the bundle, the configuration, everything, and if you remove the dependency, we are removing all the things as well. If we want to go fast, I would highly recommend you to use this bundle, the Maker bundle, which is a way to get started faster with your own code. So Symfony Flex is really about installing dependencies, and the Maker bundle is what you would use to create files and to get started with your controllers, model, Twig templates, and so on. Okay, so as you can see here, Composer require Maker. Maker is not a package name, right? Symfony/maker-bundle is actually the package name. And with Symfony Flex, we added some nice shortcut and some nice items on top of Composer, and Aliases is one of them. So when you are using Composer require Maker, behind the scenes, Symfony Flex is actually converting Maker to Symfony/maker-bundle so that Composer knows which package to install. So we have a bunch of them. It makes your life easier. So you can say just Composer require b-add or PHP unit. That works. It installs the right thing. It's also optimized for Symfony, which means that you never have to add Symfony/something. So you can say Symfony require workflow or require console or whatever. It just works. It also means that we have opinionated choices. So if you say require API, you're going to have API platform installed for you. If you are saying require ORM, then you are going to have Doctrine installed for you. Okay, so we have aliases and we also have packs. Remember, we don't have all the Symfony components by default, only the ones that you are using. But at some point, you will want to debug your project. So you want to get Monologue, probably the profiler as well, PHP unit, var dumper, and a bunch of other ones. So it would be tedious to actually require all of them one by one. So we have packs. A pack is just an empty package with more dependencies. So here you can see the debug package or pack, and you can see that we have the debug bundle, the Monologue bundle, the profiler pack, which is another pack, a PHP unit, and so on. And then it installs all the dependencies coming from those dependencies. If you want to learn more about all the aliases and the packs and all the recipes that we have, you can go to this website, flex.symfony.com, where we list all of the information about those packages and recipes. Let's get started. So we required Maker, and if we diff, you can see that the Maker bundle was registered by default automatically for the development environment, because of course you're not going to create anything in production. And if you have a look at all the things that you can do with the Maker bundle, you can see that you can create a bunch of things. You can create a new controller, a new command, a new form, a migration for Doctrine, a Twig extension, a user, etc., etc. And we are adding more on a regular basis. So that's what we have right now. Okay, so if you try to create a new controller, again, we have opinionated choices. So we think that it's better to use annotations in your controller so that all the configuration for the controller is in the same file. So we recommend you to actually require annotation, which is not there by default. And you have a great error message saying what you need to do. So we require the annotation. It's going to install a bunch of things and running some recipes to actually enable all the things. And then we can create a controller. So here we're going to create a default controller. And I'm not sure if you have ever used a bundle for Symfony 2 and Symfony 3. It was named Symfony, I don't remember, to create things. Anyway, it was kind of complex because we had to create files and configuration. Here, when you say make controller, default controller, as you can see, we only generate one file. No configuration whatsoever. And that's the great thing about Symfony 4. You never, ever have to create, not never, but rarely have to create a configuration file or register a service or whatever. Everything should be done automatically for you, which means that the maker bundle is very simple because of the number of files that we need to configure. So that's what you get in your source directory. As you can see, there is nothing related to Symfony here. The namespace is app. App is your namespace. You can do whatever you want. Here, we are extending abstract controller, but that's not a requirement. It's totally optional. But to get started faster, it's nice. Here you can see that we are generating a JSON file because we don't have Twig by default. If we require Twig before creating a controller, then we would have a Twig used here. And you can see also one major change. We don't have bundles anymore for your project, right? When you create your project, you don't need to create a bundle. It doesn't mean that we don't have bundles anymore. Bundles are still very useful to actually share common code between different projects, but within a project, we don't need bundles, right? So we got rid of that concept for application. You can still do that if you want, but by default, it's not what we are recommending. And that's the main point. Symfony 4 helps you grow your app with ease, right? So we start very small. You can add more dependencies. They are auto-configured via Symfony Flex, and you can use Make a Bundle to actually create more files, which means that you are really only responsible for your business logic, which is nice. Okay, if we want some templates, we can require Twig, and that's the diff that I've done to actually render a Twig template instead of the default one. And you can see that here I have injected Twig, the Twig environment, directly into my action. And here you can see that I require Twig. I don't care about how to configure it. I don't care about how to register the bundle. I don't care about wiring and configuration of the container. I'm just saying, OK, give me a Twig environment. And then you can render your first template really fast. No configuration again. OK. Let me show you a very interesting example. At some point, you will probably want to, if you are using Twig, create a Twig extension, right? And the first question is, where do I store my Twig extension, the class? Under source/Twig, source/Twig/extension. What is the best practice? I don't know. So you need to read the documentation, right? And then, which interface do I need to implement? Which class do I need to extend? Is there an abstract class that is useful for me? Again, you need to check the documentation. Which file do I need to change to register my extension? And if you are using Symfony 3, you need to explicitly register your extension. Which tag do I need to use? If you are using YAML, that's a challenge, right? Because it's an array of an hash where you can say which tag. So at some point, it's too complex. And a bunch of people, they are not using extension, and they are not going to create a Twig extension because it's too complex, which means that they are going to outcode things into the controller and pass these directly in the template. In Symfony 4, it's not the case anymore. You create a Twig extension via the make Twig extension command. You have a template. you write your logic in this class template, done. You don't need to register anything, you don't need to ask any question, you don't need to read the documentation. It's only about your code, that's all. And this kind of automation, it works for a bunch of things. Twig extension, as we've just seen, event listeners, doctrine repositories, voters, commands, registration form system, users, and again, we are adding more on a regular basis. That's nice. Hello world, always very easy. You can, use any framework for that, and it's always very easy to create an hello world. So we want to go beyond that. I want to use doctrine. I want to use a database. I want to create an API, and I want to create an admin for managing my data. So what you can do is you can require ORM admin API. Right? It's going to install a lot of dependencies, I would say. It's going to add a lot of configuration, as you can see on the right side of the screen. But I've done nothing, just require those 3 aliases. One note here, I'm not sure about Ukraine, but I used to live in the US, in San Francisco. And in San Francisco, the internet is really slow. I can tell you, really slow. Yeah, that's kind of funny. So I wanted to have something really fast when creating a new project. So, and as you can see here, we are prefetching packages. So if you are using Symfony Flex, you will see that requiring new packages is way faster than using Composer directly because, and only if you have curl. If you have curl, we are going to first download all the packages in parallel, and then we are going to install all of them one by one. And it's way faster than using Composer directly. Okay, so now that I have an ORM, API, and admin, I'm going to create a product, which is my entity, and I'm going to say that I want an API resource linked to the product. So I'm going to answer a bunch of questions about which fields I want to create for my product. And when it's done, I have just one piece of configuration here, and that's, I want to say that for easy admin, I want the product to be managed by the admin gen. So that's the only thing that you need to do, and on the right side, you see the code generated by the maker bundle for my product entity. Then, I need to use some environment variables, and that's something new also in Symfony 4. Instead of having a bunch of configuration and parameters directly in your YAML files, which is really Symfony-centric, we are now using something that is used by many frameworks out there and not just in the PHP world, environment variables. And that's great when you are using some hosting providers that are using also environment variables. So here, I'm using a .env file where I'm setting the database URL. I'm going to use SQLite for ease here. Then I'm going to create a database and update the schema. I could have used a migration here as well. It would not have been that complex. That's all. So remember, I have required one command to require ORM, admin, and API. One annotation added, that's not the case anymore, and it works. You have an admin and you have an API. And I have a small video to prove that it works, and you can try at home, it should work as well. So you have an admin to be able to add products, you have API platform so that you can create an ASPA, for instance, with React or any JavaScript framework for the front end, and it just works. So you can create projects also via the API if you want to. Whatever, Jelly Bean, okay. And then if you go back to the admin, it's going to be there, of course. It's in the database, and you can then edit, delete, or whatever. It is that simple. And again, the only thing that I've done is creating a product entity and managing the fields that I want for my product. Okay, so that's the very first part, trying to make it very easy to get started and to grow your application. The next thing that we have done, and it's also part of Symfony 4.3 that was released yesterday, is trying to think about the typical features that you are using on a daily basis and how we can simplify your life and how we can get them to the next level. And the very first thing we've worked on is how you send emails. How many of you are not sending emails in their applications? Probably nobody, right? And the thing is, one. Okay. So right now, you are probably using SwiftMailer, and I've been maintaining SwiftMailer for the last 10 years. But the thing is, it's quite complex. The code is quite complex. It's not modern PHP anymore. It's a nightmare to maintain. So I wanted to create something else. So now we have the Symfony mailer, which is, I think, way better. And let's see how that works. So I want to send emails from my controller, basic need. So I'm going to require a Symfony mailer, and I'm going to edit my .env file, setting the mailer DSN. Here I'm using this SMTP of my localhost machine. And as it was the case for Twig, I am injecting the mailer interface, don't care about how it's configured, and then I can say mailer send, and I'm sending a message, an email here. Very simple. And you can do the exact same thing with SwiftMailer, right? Now, I want to send rich emails, and that's more interesting here. What you can do is you don't have to change anything. Instead of creating an email, now you create a templated email, which means that it's an email using Twig for the text and the HTML. And then, instead of just setting a text, I can say HTML template and give it an HTML template, a Twig template, where you would have your code. And you can also pass a context, which is a context that you will get in the Twig template. Okay, so I want rich emails, of course, but I want responsive emails. And that's where you can't do that easily with SwiftMailer. You require an extension for Twig, Inky, and then you have a bunch of tags that are containers, really, for your emails that are converted to HTML. And the great thing is that if you are doing that, then your emails are going responsive. And you can also create some columns and complex emails and email templates if you need to. So this one is a very simple one. I forgot your password email, but you can get fancy if you want to. Okay, so I want to send rich and responsive emails, of course, but I don't want to use SMTP. I want to use a provider. And most of you are probably using some kind of providers, SendGrid, Mailgun, MailChimp, whatever. So out of the box, and that's new in Symfony Mailer, you can't do that with SwiftMailer. We have a bunch of providers, Amazon, Google, Gmail, Mandrill, Mailgun, Postmark, SendGrid, by default, built-in. So the only thing that you need to do is actually to change your mailer DSN. That's all. That's the only thing you need to do, and all of a sudden, instead of using SMTP, it's going to use a provider and the HTTP API for that. Now, it's great, but you know that sending emails from a controller is not a best practice, right? I don't want my user to wait for the email to be sent before getting the response. And if there is an issue, then they won't have a response. They will probably have a 500 or something like that. That's not really nice. So I want to send my email asynchronously. With Symfony 4.3, I'm going to require the messenger component, which is new in Symfony 4.1, and then I have only one configuration to change, which is the routing. And the great thing about the mailer interface is that if you have this piece of configuration, without changing your controller, your emails are going to be sent asynchronously. Remove this line, they are going to be sent synchronously, right? And then you need to consume the message with the messenger column consume command. That's all. Okay, so here I've done that with Doctrine, and that's new in Symfony 4.3. You can see the transport here. I'm sending email asynchronously via the Doctrine transport, but I want to use AMQP, which is probably something you want to do instead of using Doctrine here. Very simple. Okay, so you need to install RabbitMQ, of course, and then You can change the DSN and use AMQP, and then your login password and the domain and the URL for your RabbitMQ server. That's the only thing you need to change. And as you can see, there is a reference here. So for the send email message, you are using the email transport, which means that you have a bunch of different transports. So you can also have doctrine for other kind of messages if that makes sense for you. You are not required to only use one transport. So let's recap. Symfony 4 tries to do all the work for you automatically. Auto-configuration, the maker bundle, no boilerplate code anymore. We are doing that for you, and then you are just writing the business logic. The controllers and the commands are services, which means that you can inject any dependency in there. They are going to be auto-configured automatically. And as you understand, your productivity is going to be much better, and the developer experience is much better, hopefully. So now I want to take 5 minutes to talk a bit about Symfony and the ecosystem and why I think that using Symfony is the right thing to do. So the first thing is Symfony is probably the most featureful and the most downloaded, that's for sure, framework out there. 2.5 billion downloads of the bundles and the core components. That's about 50 downloads per second. 50 downloads per second. And we have more than 100 packages, so whatever the needs you have, we probably have a component that you can use to implement your features. We have the most advanced API solution, API platform. How many of you have already used or tried API platform? Okay, so I highly recommend you to have a look at API platform, especially if you have an SPA in the front end. It's nice, it's very nice. We have a great e-commerce solution with Cilius, many admin gen solutions for the back end. And the great thing about Symfony, and that's something I wanted to do with Symfony version 2, one of the goals of Symfony 2 was to be the foundation for the PHP ecosystem. And a lot of great frameworks, e-commerce solutions, CMSs in the PHP world are using Symfony. Not necessarily the full stack framework, but a bunch of the components that we have. And remember that the components are totally independent, and we're trying really hard to keep it that way. So if you need to create a very small command line interface for something, you can just use the Symfony console component. You don't need to bring all the components in there. And here you have something that works. You only need a few lines of code to create a command. And that's the case for many components. So you can use the Symfony mailer component without using the Symfony full stack framework. And the same goes for the workflow, HTTP, HTTP Foundation, of course, HTTP client, and almost all of them, really. Okay. This one is also very important for me, and that's all about the processes that we have in the Symfony world. Being predictable is very important for our users. So some of you ask me about Symfony 5 and when it's going to be available, and I can tell you it's going to be released at the end of November this year. No questions about that, that's for sure. So every 6 months, we have a new release. Every 2 years, we have a major release. Talking about processes, so we have standard releases and LTS releases, so the support for LTS releases is way bigger than standard releases. That being said, nowadays, I would not recommend you to use LTS releases anymore. It was great a few years back, but now that we have a great backward compatibility policy in the Symfony world, I think it is much better and much easier to actually upgrade every 6 months to the next minor version. It's more effective, it's more efficient, instead of waiting 2 years before doing all the things in one go. Okay, So stability, I've talked about the backward compatibility policy, strict semantic versioning. It doesn't mean that from time to time we are not breaking backward compatibility, but whenever we are breaking backward compatibility, that's a bug. And most of the time we fix the bug. The only case where we are allowed to break backward compatibility is for security issues. If there is no other way to fix a security issue, we are going to break backward compatibility. And I think it happened once in the last 5 years. Okay. And the good news is that we are the fastest framework around. Is it important? I think it's not. But, you know, it's always some kind of things that comes from time to time a requirement for some projects. So the great news is that Symfony 4 is the fastest framework around, and I can tell you all the frameworks are fast enough for 99% of the websites out there. But anyway, it's always nice to see that we are really fast as well. And last but not the least, the great thing about Symfony is, you know, the fact that you can start really small. And that's why Silex is not maintained anymore. We don't need Silex anymore. And using Symfony 4 really feels like using Silex, the macro framework. So you can grow as you see fit, and everything is automated. We like the community, and I think, and I've written about that a few times already, but code is nothing without the community, right? If we don't have users, you can have the best code out there. If it is not used, that's not open source, really. And during the last 3 years, we have worked really hard trying to create a better community, a more inclusive community, with a bunch of initiatives. So we have a code of conduct, we have the core team, and in the documentation, we have a bunch of documents trying to explain how to be nice with other Symfony community members. And that's all for today. Thank you for listening. If you have any question, I think we have 3 minutes for that.
Thank you for coming on the PHP fwdays conference and giving this talk. Yes, we have a lot of questions. They are on a slide on the screen, so I would like to ask the audience to go over the questions and put your likes, while I will ask the first one, the most liked. Why Symfony left framework interoperability group, and does it mean that you are abandoning future PSR interoperability?
Okay, so the question is about PSR and the Fig.
Yeah, so why you left?
Why we left?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it recorded?
Yes.
Okay, so I can't answer the question. That's a very tough question, and I would need more than 2 minutes, really. But basically, also, first of all, we are the framework implementing the most PSRs out there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 16, 11, a bunch of them, really. But at some point, PSRs are relevant if they are about being sure that the frameworks and all the libraries work well together and trying to build on top of what already exists. If not, you are not interoperable. And I think the Fig did a great job with the first PSRs. But at some point, we also need to acknowledge that we don't need to create more PSRs. And if you create more PSRs, it's not about interoperability anymore. It's about creating a new framework. And PSR 7, at least that's my point, PSR 7 was not about interoperability. Why? Because they did not include Symfony needs. And Symfony HTTP Foundation and HTTP kernel, it was created a long time ago. And I think things can be improved, but we were not able to actually move the needle here. So at some point, we made a decision to say, we will not be able to migrate to PSR 7 because of backward compatibility issues. And we don't want to break backward compatibility for our users. That's the promise that we did. That's our policy. So we will never, ever adopt PSR 7, which means that they decided that Symfony was out of the FIG. But we tried really hard, and with some success, PSR 11, which was a good one about the container. We had a bunch of discussion to be sure that we would be able to adopt that. It worked. We did the same with another one I don't remember. And then PSR 18, for instance, for HTTP client, that doesn't work for us because PSR 18 depends on PSR 7. So at some point, when the FIG doesn't care about Symfony, what do? You leave. You're saying, okay, you don't want us to be part of the FIG. The only choice is we need to leave. That's okay. So, and Laravel is not part of the FIG as well, and I think for the exact same reasons. So how can you create PSRs that are the voice of the PHP community if the two most successful frameworks are not part of the discussions, Laravel and Symfony? That doesn't work for me. That's all.
Okay, thank you for the answer. And the next question is mine. What is the future of PHP? As you think, will we still render HTML, or will we delegate to JavaScript, or something other will happen?
That's a great question. So basically, is PHP dead? Right?
Nope.
I don't think so. So it's always very easy to say, PHP is shit, that's not a real language. And I'm the first one to acknowledge that PHP is not the best language out there, right? But it gets the job done. And I think even if PHP is not a great language, PHP is a great platform, and that's very different. It's very easy to host a PHP application anywhere, right? You don't need a bunch of microservices, you don't need Docker, you don't need a bunch of things to make it work. It's very easy. And I think that's the main selling point of PHP. And that's why I think it's still useful in the future, and I think the future of PHP is bright. The first thing. Of course, JavaScript is going to be huge in the next few years, in the back end and in the front end, but I think it would not be wise to actually move everything to JavaScript. I think the PHP world is much more mature than the JavaScript world right now. I'm also very interested in one other language, and that's the Go language. How many of you are using Go somehow? Okay. So to me, Go is a language created by Google with big names. And if you have a look at Go, I would say that the language is not pure in the sense that they have shortcuts, a bit like PHP. They don't have exceptions. It's not object-oriented. They have their own ways. And to me, PHP and Go are about the same. Pragmatic languages to get the job done. And that's what I like. I like to do business. I don't care about languages wars. I don't care. I want to do business, and PHP, Go, JavaScript are the best tools for the job.
Okay, thank you for the answer. So the next question is, what is the best framework except Symfony in your humble opinion?
So a year ago, I would have been able to say Silex, right? It's not possible anymore. That's a very tough question because I'm not using any other framework. So I can't tell. I think the community chose Laravel, so I would say Laravel.
Thank you. The next question would be, what is the next big thing in Symfony? Asynchronous, PHP, or something else? What do you plan? So
the way we work with Symfony is not that, wow, there is this new cool thing in the web world, so we're going to implement that in Symfony. We never add a feature just because it is cool or hype or whatever. We add a feature because we have a need, because it solves a problem. And that's exactly what I did with Symfony Flex. With Symfony Flex and everything I've talked about today, it's not like at some point I say, wow, I'm going to create Symfony Flex and it's going to be huge. I had a bunch of problems, a list of problems that I wanted to fix. And those problems, they come from you, from the feedback, from the issues that you create, from the complexities that you are reporting on GitHub. And I was thinking about all the problems and all the things that they had in common and trying to figure out how to make the experience better. And that's how I created Symfony Flex. And that's the same for all the features that we have in Symfony. When I wanted to create HTTP client or Symfony mailer, it was not like, wow, I want to get rid of Swift mailer, I'm going to create the next big thing, it's going to be Symfony mailer. We had feedback, people wanted to use providers like SendGrid and Mailgun. It was kind of complex to implement that into Swift mailer, so we worked on that. And that's the same for async PHP. If it proves useful in the PHP world, why not? And there are a bunch of experiments right now in the PHP world, but also in the Symfony world. If you are interested in that, you can have a look at Google, and if you type Symfony asynchronous and some other probably keywords, you will see that some people are working on trying to make sure that Symfony works well with asynchronous PHP if it is a thing at some point. And the good news is that there are some prototypes that work really well without changing everything. I don't want to change everything because of backward compatibility. So if we can find a way to hook into the HTTP kernel and make things asynchronous, that would be really great.
Okay, thank you for the answer. Occasionally, the next question is also about asynchronous React PHP, Swoo, and etc. in Symfony. So I think we can check it like answered. And ask the next one, what is the killer feature for Symfony 5, on your opinion?
The what?
So what killing feature in Symfony 5 are you planning to implement?
You will need to come to Amsterdam for SymfonyCon. And quite honestly, I have no idea, or I have ideas actually. Symfony 5.0 is actually very boring because all the features are part of minor versions. So we add features in Symfony 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, 4.4, and 5.0 is exactly the same as 4.4, same features. The only thing is that we removed the legacy features and the deprecation layer that allows you to upgrade easily. So when you want to jump from 4.4 to 5.0, the features are the same, but you need to get rid of all the deprecations that you have in your application, and then you can migrate. And when you are on 5.0, then it's getting exciting again, because we are going to add more features in 5.1 and 5.2 and so on.
Okay, so the next one is, the question is, MVC is getting old as an architecture, so middlewares are getting more popular, and will Symfony adopt PSR 15 to a certain extent in future?
Okay, so the good news is that Symfony 2 and more is not MVC. It has never been MVC, so I don't care if it's getting old. Symfony version 2 is a request-response framework. So if you have a look at all the documentation, we are not talking about MVC. The only thing that we are doing, and we've been doing that for the last 10 years, is that we are an HTTP framework. And HTTP is all about having a request, doing something, and getting a response. And your job is to do the something in the middle, which is a controller or anything else. We don't care. So we don't need a PSR for that. We don't need external documents for that. We've been doing that for 10 years, so old news, really.
Okay. The next question is also mine, and the question is, what changes in PHP do you expect to happen, and why, and how they affect Symfony?
Okay. So talking about PHP being dead or not, if you have a look at all the new features that we got in the PHP core during the last few years, that's amazing, really. I'm not sure if there are other languages still evolving at that pace. And the great thing is that we have great people working for PHP core. And now they are listening to the community as well, so they are taking into account what we as developers and users of PHP, what we need and what is useful for us. And I think one of the great feature, it's not a feature change in the PHP core, is the way they are making it more I don't have the word. Consistent. PHP is getting more consistent. And all the edge cases that we have are deprecated and will be removed in PHP 8. And that's a very good news. And everything that has been done for performance is also good news. If you have performance for free when upgrading from a PHP version to the next, is always good news. And last but not the least, I also like the fact that they care. It was not the case before, but now they really care about backward compatibility, which means that it is much easier, much faster, and convenient to upgrade from one version of PHP to the next.
Okay, so do you expect something special from PHP that you would like to use?
Something special? No, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, Symfony 1 was a monolith, and Symfony 2 and 3 were bundles, and we're getting back to monolith in Symfony 4. So do you think it was a bad decision?
No. I mean, I don't like big words. So what is a monolith? I think Symfony 1, 2, 3, 4, they are all about creating monolith. That being said, it's not the case in Symfony 4. Bundles are not about creating a monolith or not. It's about a structure, about your code. You create a bundle if you want to reuse a feature. And that's why I decided to remove the bundles for your applications, because there was a misunderstanding. People thought that they need to create a user bundle and a blog bundle and a forum bundle, a bundle for each feature. That doesn't work. If the bundles needs the other ones to work, and if they are tightly coupled, then you don't have bundles. You have one big bundle, and you have the overhead of having bundles. So I think it's much better to actually structure your code based on your business model and business logic instead of a structure given by the framework. And the fact that Symfony 4 is a framework that you can use for very small applications means that you can also use, and because also we have API platform, you can also use Symfony as a base for your microservices needs very easily. Less overheads, less dependencies, and a great way to do API calls as well. So I'm not sure if we are back to a monolith. I think that's quite the contrary, actually.
Okay, and I think we have the time for the last question. And the questions feed is like crazy. The first question changes every 2 seconds, and I can't decide what should I ask. Currently on top is my question again. No, not mine. Let's wait 5 seconds more. Okay, all examples in Symfony documentation contains logic in controller. It is not what MVC really is. So what architecture do you recommend to use in Symfony 4? Maybe you can give information where we can find examples.
Okay, so documentation is an interesting topic, I would say. So the first complexity of the Symfony documentation comes from the fact that we are a full stack framework, but also a set of components. So It's always about documenting the component without the full stack framework, but also having examples using the full stack framework. And we also want to have the shortest documentation possible. We don't want long documents, because I know that you are not reading documentation. I'm not doing that either. So if it is short, we have more chance that you are going to actually read the documentation. So having some logic in the controller when it comes to the documentation makes things easier to understand, easier to document, easier to explain. So that's why it's done that way. Now, talking about what you need to do in your applications, I don't know. I mean, it really depends. It depends on the size of your application. It depends on the skills of the developers that you have in your team. It depends on the size of the team. So there is no one answer for any projects out there. That's also why we are talking about best practices. I don't like the term best practices, because the best practices depends on your needs. So if you need to be really fast, if you have only 1 month to create a project, the best practices are not the same as for a project that you will maintain for the next 10 years. The best practices are totally different. So there is no unique way of doing things. And I think you are in charge of that structure and how you actually create your environment, how you want to develop your project. It also depends on the methodology that you have. Are you using an agile methodology or not? So many factors, really.
Okay, so let's give an applause to Fabien Potencier.